Hello again biologists, Mr. Kinnear here with another video lesson for National 5 Biology. We're at the very end of Unit 3, Life on Earth, and speciation is the second half of Key Area 3.6, Evolution of a Species. So in the first half of Key Area 3.6 we looked at mutations, and they were defined as random changes to the genetic codes stored in DNA. We also looked at variation, so we know that there's differences in the genetic codes within a species, whether that's humans, other animals or plants. And adaptations are how a species is suited to the conditions of its own environment. And that leads us on to survival of the fittest. Now you may think of that term referring to the strongest, the fastest, the most intelligent, but that's not what Charles Darwin coined that phrase meaning. So it was about being adaptive to change. We're also then going to look at speciation. That is how a new species can come about. So that's what we're going to be looking at today in the second half of Key Area 3.6. And a great example to talk about when we think about survival of the fittest is the peppered moth. As you can see, it is found in two forms, a light form on the left and a melanic or dark form on the right. That term melanic relates to the amount of melanin produced, and that's the same in humans. Darker skin is because of higher levels of melanin produced in the skin, and that colour or the amount of melanin is controlled by a gene. So what do we expect the numbers of each of those two types of moth to be? Maybe you might expect the numbers to be equal. It's just random that there's light coloured moths and dark coloured moths. But if we were to sample the peppered moth in a rural area like a Boyne, what we might actually find is that the numbers of dark and light moths is quite disparate. So is that what you would expect? And how can we explain that massive difference in numbers between those two forms? This might help. So looking at that picture now, can you see the melanic or dark moth is up here? And can you spot the light form moth? And which do you think was easiest to spot on this example? So the peppered moths normally spend their day resting on the lichens on tree bark, or barks of trees similar to the silver birch that we have out in our playgrounds. So the moths are preyed on by birds. So if you were a predatory blackbird looking for some moths to eat, what do you think you would do in this situation? Which is the easiest of those two moths to find and eat? Hopefully we can conclude that the dark moth stands out more readily from the lichen than the light moth, so the light moth is more camouflaged. Therefore, predatory birds are far more likely to eat the dark moths. Our light moths then are more likely to get to reproductive age and be able to pass on their genes to the next generation. And that's why we get those differences in numbers, because it's far more likely that the second generation are going to be passed on the light genes rather than the dark genes. So that's when we get a term such as selection pressure. So in this example, the selection pressure is predation. If you can camouflage yourself from predation, you are more likely to survive. If you stand out to predators, then you're less likely to survive. However, if we sample the moths in an industrial area, we get quite a difference, with the melanic moths or dark moths being far more abundant than their light variants. So how can we explain that change in numbers? In industrial areas, particularly after the Industrial Revolution and before we had environmental campaigns, we're far more likely to be blackened by pollution from factories and from transport. And straight away, you might be able to spot our light variant far more readily than the melanic variant. So that explains then why in these conditions our light moth is far more likely to be predated and picked out, because it is no longer camouflaged against a natural environment. It stands out against the blackened trees and therefore our melanic variant is far more likely to survive and pass on its genes to the next generation. And that leads us back to this term, survival of the fittest. As I said right back at the start, it's not always about being the toughest or the strongest, as the term might suggest. It's about being best suited to your environment. So variation in the population, there's two types of moth, the light and the dark form. Some individuals have a greater chance of survival, so a better chance of hiding from predators in this example. Individuals that survive will live long enough to breed and pass on their genes to their offspring. We then get a change in population over time, so dependent on the selection pressure, the gene pool changes. And in this example, the selection pressure remains the same. It's predation by birds, but the environment has been changed. So therefore, predation by birds of the two variants change because of the camouflage against the background. But we then have evolution by natural selection. So natural selection means the best adapted individuals survive. So again, referring back to this term, survival of the fittest. And that leads us on to speciation, which is the formation of a new species through the process of evolution. And if you remember back to the start of Unit 3 when we were looking at the key words involved in ecology, then a species is the largest group of organisms in which any two individuals of the appropriate sex can produce fertile offspring. A good example to talk about when we're trying to define species is the big cats. So you could actually breed a tiger and a lion. You would actually get an offspring which is known as a liger. It's a huge cat, and as you can see it has some attributes of both tiger and lion. They are, however, infertile, so you couldn't take two ligers and breed them. They would not produce any offspring. So something has clearly happened within the big cats, that these are completely different species. They cannot produce fertile offspring. And something you'll be familiar with, you can breed any type of dog together. So a Labrador and a Poodle produces the cute little Labradoodle, and you could do any type of crossbreeding, any type of dog with any other type of dog, or even you can actually crossbreed wool with a dog and it gets successful breeding. So those are not different species. So we actually consider that dogs and wolves are still the same species. So something has not happened there to actually clearly define them as separate species. So we'll talk you through the stages of speciation, and we start with these little pea body guys. They are a large population with a common gene pool. They can successfully breed with each other generation after generation. And what will happen is we'll get some form of isolation, two populations separated by a barrier. In this example we've got a mountain range, and you might say to yourself, well, a mountain range can't just appear. But when we're talking about evolution, this has happened over thousands or millions of years. So the earth was changing. So we did have earthquakes, we had the shifting of continental shelves, all sorts of things that will have caused mountain ranges, rivers, oceans to change, isolating populations. And we still have that to an extent. Obviously we still have earthquakes and we still have volcanoes, and we've also got climate change which may cause the change in waterways. So as you can see here, we've now got two populations. They again are exactly the same as they were. We've just separated them. But over the course of time, as these guys breed, we will get mutations. So remember, mutations, the change in the genetic codes, which can happen completely randomly. And on the left hand side, you can see we've got one mutation which gets them larger ears, and another mutation which gets them hair on their bodies. And on the right hand side, we've got one mutation which gives them large antennae and one that makes them go blue. We then get the process of natural selection on either side of the mountain range, but these things are happening separately. So what we might find is that the temperature on the left hand side gets quite cold, and therefore the pea bodies with the hairy bodies have a selective advantage. So obviously they can be kept warm by that mutation of getting extra hair on their bodies. And on the right hand side, perhaps we have some blue flowers or blue foliage that allows the blue pea bodies to hide better from predators. So the selection pressure there is predators, and then the blue forms can hide better from the predators. So what that then means is that over the course of time, that is a very long time, the populations therefore can no longer interbreed to produce fertile offspring. So what's happened is that their genetic information has changed so much over the course of time. When you put them back together, you could not successfully breed a blue body and a hairy body together like the original pea body organisms could right back at the start. So we now have two different species. When they're back together, they cannot breed and produce fertile offspring. And I'll just put that speciation information into text form for you. So we've got a large population occupying an area and freely interbreeding so they can share the same gene pool. But something happens where that population becomes split in two, becoming completely isolated from each other by a barrier. And at National 5, we're just talking about geographical barriers. So the easiest thing to think about is a mountain range or a river in between the two populations. When we get to higher biology next year, then we'll start to talk about the different types of speciation, so ecological or reproductive. But at the moment, just think about the geographical barriers, rivers or mountains. Mutations occur at random in each population. They therefore gradually acquire different genes and chromosomes. Natural selection then works on each population, again favouring the best adapted so they can carry on breeding and passing on their genes to the next generation, and removing the least well adapted, so again removing them from the gene pool so they can't pass on their genes to the next generation. And then over the course of time, the chromosomes in each subpopulation become so different that fertilisation cannot take place. So we get no interbreeding between the two new species that have been formed. So that's us for today's lesson. That actually finishes Unit 3 and therefore the entire National 5 Biology course. Today we've looked at the fact that variation can lead to organisms being better adapted to different conditions in different environments. And if a population of organisms is separated, different selection pressures can act on different groups. And therefore a new species is formed when two subpopulations are so different they can no longer interbreed. So that's us, as I say, finished the entire course. Hopefully you found that informative and engaging. As always, if you have any problems, give me a shout and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye.